All right. Well, thank you everyone for being here. My name is Michael Fraud. I'm the Assistant Program Director at Drisha, and very happy to welcome everyone back for what is unfortunately our last session for this series on imagining King David in the Babylonian Talmud. We've been learning together for quite a few weeks now, and we've been able to add these two sessions to be able to finish making our way through a little bit more of the material. With that, I am going to turn it over to Rabbi Silber.
Okay, good evening, everybody. This is the last session of this series. I added two classes. I felt there was a lot more to say and to give a more rounded picture of what the Bavli thinks or imagines David is. I did want to make one comment before we begin, which is that, and this is, I think, important to remember about the Talmud, about the Medrash. The Medrash, the Talmud, is not in a vacuum. It's not functioning in a vacuum. The tradition functions within sources that already exist. They try to shape it, they try to move it in certain directions, but for the most part, the tradition does not ignore what comes before. So it's very important to remember, and actually, that's true in terms of texts, it's true in terms of life. You can have two people saying exactly the same thing, but it means two very different things, because one is on a certain trajectory, the other is not. So it's very important to remember that. It's particularly important in terms of the text, the Babylonian texts that we are studying, the Bavli, in terms of David. And what we've seen so far, what we focused on, the various stories that we saw and descriptions of David, for the most part, are descriptions that are about the Book of Shmuel, stories that appear in the Book of Shmuel. We began with David and Bathsheba, and we moved from there to other stories. And the Bavli typically has a very nuanced approach towards all the stories, but the stories that we saw are, for many of them, if not most of them, maybe all of them so far, do have critiques of David, some rather powerful critiques of David. On the other hand, remember the Bavli is not making that up. The Book of Shmuel has very powerful critiques of David. The Book of Chronicles does not. The Psalms, for the most part, do not. The Psalms relate to events in David's life. But the Book of Shmuel has a different agenda to it, which is to describe kingship. One might say the pitfalls of kingship, the dangers of kingship. But on the other hand, and we'll see this evening, the Book of Shmuel, in my understanding of it, also presents the other side of David, kind of ideal. In fact, I've just written, together with my compatriot Ben Zion Ovadia in Israel. He writes it, and we work together. I tell him what I've been teaching. He writes it down. It's in Hebrew. We just submitted it to the publisher. It should be out in 6 months. He writes a very, not easy and very beautiful Hebrew, poetic Hebrew. And in that book, I tried to present exactly what we've had here, we'll have tonight as well, which is the Book of Shmuel is very complex and presents both sides of David. On one hand, he's the ideal king. He's capable of great gestures, of deep understanding, of great compassion. At the same time, what power can do to you is to allow you to make bad decisions, and I think even equally important, to fail to see, to fail to have the perception. So, and we have with us evening Tova Bulau, who sponsored this book. She also sponsored, by the way, the Haggadah. The Passover Haggadah was written with the assistance of Tova and the Bulau family. Very grateful to that. And the Book of Shmuel has been really taught Shmuel several times. And thank you, Tova, and looking forward to it coming out hopefully before Pesach. Now to our subject of the evening, which is the same subject, David. So I mentioned that there's another side to David in the Book of Shmuel. And I will begin with a verse that is found in the 8th chapter of 2 Samuel. You don't have it in your text, but I'll tell you what it is. At the end, the 8th chapter describes briefly David's career, the successes of David's career. his various victories in war. He's a great warrior. And the end of that chapter, chapter 8, it says, Vahi David Oseh Mishpatu Tzedakah L'chol Amo, that David did Mishpat and Tzedakah. Mishpat and Tzedakah, which is justice, equity, and justice to all the people. That's a description of David, a kind of objective description. It's not a story. It's a statement that the Book of Samuel makes about David. Mishpat u'tzedakah l'chol amo. Now we'll come back to that expression, that phrase, that David, in describing David. See, the Book of Shmuel describes David in two ways. The book has the author, implied author, writing about David, telling us information, and then the book has stories. So the statements about David, many of them are very positive statements, and then you have the stories. And the question is, how does one relate the story to the kind of objective statement about David? And the point is that we take both seriously. We take the objective statement, and David acted with justice and righteousness and equity to all his people. And then you have stories, and the stories suggest that it's not that simple, that in fact, often David does not act in a just manner, in a fair manner, etc. So the Book of Shmuel has both of these views of David, and the Bavli does as well. Till now, we focused a lot on one might say, the problems that David engenders and encounters. And this evening, I wanted to look at primarily a different text. We like to end on positive notes in general. And we'll begin this evening with the main text of the evening, which is a passage from the Gemara in Psachim, page 119b. Psachim Kuf Yutet Amud Bet. So let's get to that text. Do we have that text? 119b, Gemara, Talmud Bavli, Psachim. Okay. Everybody sees that. Psachim Kuf Yutet Amud Bet. Darash Rav Avira. Rav Avira taught. Zimnin Amalei Mishmei de Rav Ami, Zimnin Amala Mishmei de Rav Asi. So sometimes he would say it in the name of Rav Ami, sometimes in the name of Rav Asi. This was a drasha he would give more than once. My dichtiv vayigdal hayelet vayigamal. What is the meaning of the verse? The child grew up and was weaned. Now that verse, those three words, vayigdal hayelet vayigamal, has nothing to do with David. Those three words refer to the birth of Isaac. That Isaac was born miraculously to Sarah. Vayigdal hayelet vayigamal, and it says after he was weaned, so he was fully nursed. He grew up and was fully nursed. And the text continues in Breshit, chapter 21, Vayasa Abraham Mishte Gadol, B'yom Higamel et Yitzchak. That Abraham made a big party on the day that Isaac was weaned. That's what it says in the Torah. Rav Avira has a drasha. So let's see what the drasha is. So Rav Avira said the following. He said, Atid HaKadosh Baruch Hu Lasot Suda. In the future, God will make a feast. God will make a feast, prepare a feast for the righteous ones. On the day that God Yigomel Chaspel extends God's mercies. Ligmol Chesed is to extend mercies. When something happened to someone, they were in danger. Brikat Hagomel. Hagomel Chayavim Tovot Shekemalani Kol Tov. On the day that God will extend bounties or kindnesses to Isaac's descendants. And it describes a great meal that will take place in the future, where God, with the great heroes, many of the great heroes of our tradition, are gathered at a meal sometime in the distant future, perhaps the end of days, and they're gathered at a meal. The Torah said that Abraham made a meal, B'yom higomer et Yitzchak, and now God has a meal for the descendants of Isaac. So the first question is, before we jump into the story, what is the drasha here? What does one thing have to do with the other? The Torah says that Isaac grew up, Vayigdal hayeled vayikamal, Vayas Abraham mishteh gadol, and Rav Avira begins to talk about a meal in the future that God will invite the celebrants to join, eating and drinking. On the time that God extends is Gomel Chesed to the children of Isaac. So I was thinking, just in terms of what the Medrash means over here, or what is bothering the Medrash, actually, one might say, what's the problem? What does one thing have to do with the other? I have a suggestion. I haven't seen this anyplace, but I suggest that what's bothering the Medrash is the phrase, Vayigdal hayeled vayigamal. The boy grew up and was weaned, because you would expect it to be in the opposite order. He was weaned and he grew up. For example, the story of Moshe, when Moshe is taken by Pharaoh's daughter and his mother nurses him, then she brings him back to Pharaoh's daughter, and one or two verses later, Vayigdal Moshe vayetzer lechav. Moses was gadol, he grew up, he went out to his brethren. But here it says the opposite. Vayigdal hayeled vayigamal. The boy grew up and was fully nursed. So the order is strange. So the drasha, what it means is he was nursed and he grew up. But the drasha, which sees the order in a strange way, is interpreting vayigamal, not that he was nursed and then grew up, but he grew up. And vayigamal, they're taken from the word gemul, which is to be given some kind of reward. When the boy grew up, vayigamal, he would be given some kind of reward. What reward will he be given when he grows up? So the drasha is, it's not referring to the immediate feast that Abraham makes, but God has a parallel feast, if not for Isaac, then for Isaac's children. And now we describe this feast that will take place at the end of days, where the heroes of our tradition come together and they're eating and they're drinking. And after you have a meal together where you eat or drink, it's time to say Birkat HaMazon. So now it's time to have the grace after meals, benching, Birkat HaMazon. And now we have the following. V'yachar she'ochin v'shotim, nonim lo li'Avraham Avinu kosher bracha. So after they're finished eating, they give Abraham, someone has to lead the benching. And we know that when we have a festive occasion and someone leads the Birkat HaMazon, we often do this holding a cup of wine. At the Seder, we have Birkat HaMazon with a cup of wine. We have 4 cups of wine. One of them is Birkat HaMazon. They want to honor Abraham with Birkat HaMazon. But Abraham refuses to lead the benching. Eini mevarech, he says. I'm not the one to lead the benching. Let's move it down a little bit. He says, because Yishmael, the wicked Yishmael came from me. Okay, maybe he's not so wicked, but in this medrash, Abraham says, I'm not the right one to do it. So Abraham will say to Isaac, so he wants to pass on the cup. He says to Isaac, I can't lead the Birkat HaMazon. What did you lead it, Isaac? And Isaac says, Eini mevarech. I also can't lead it, he says, because Esav was my child. Esav was born. I'm the father of Esav. It's not appropriate for me to lead the Birkat HaMazon. So let's pass on. He refuses. So they pass on the cup to the next celebrant, Jacob. Okay, Jacob, Yaakov, you lead us in our Birkat HaMazon. And Jacob says, I can't do that. Nasati shtei achayot, I married 2 sisters, which later in the Torah becomes forbidden. Torah forbids the marriage of 2 sisters who are alive at the same time. So I can't do it either. I married Rachel, I married Leah. The Torah will forbid them to me in the future. Wasn't forbidden at this time, but in the future, I'm not appropriate. Okay, who's the next fellow on the list? Moshe Rabbeinu, a rather worthy person. They pass the cup to Moshe. Okay, Moshe, so you lead us in benching. I can't do it, he says. I never entered the land of Israel. didn't have the merit to enter the land of Israel, neither in my life nor in my death. So it's not for me. I'm not the right one to lead Birkat HaMazon in the great feast of the future. Okay, so Moshe says to his pupil, Joshua, why don't you lead us in Birkat HaMazon? And Joshua says, no, I can't do this. I didn't have any sons. And they cite a proof text, Yoshua ben Nun, and another text from Divrei HaYamim, Nun beno Yoshua beno. It's listing the genealogy. It says Nun, it says Yoshua, and then it stops after Yoshua. So the text suggests, in the eyes of the Medrash, that Yoshua has no successor. And actually, it does sound that way from the Tanakh, because after the death of Yoshua, the people say, who will lead us? And the tribe of Judah will lead us. There is no individual to lead. So there's no question about succession. So Yoshua says, it's not for me. So far, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, Moshe, and Yoshua have said, I'm not the appropriate one to lead the Birkat HaMazon at the great feast. It's God's feast. God is Gomel. God is the bountiful God has called these great people to the feast. So Yoshua says to David, why don't you take the cup and lead us? David. And David says to them, I will recite the blessing. Ani avarech. I will. V'lina el avarech. Not only do I recite the blessing, it's fitting that I recite the blessing. As it is written, as it is stated, Kos Yeshuot Esa, I raise up the cup of salvation, Uv'shem Hashem Ekra, and I call upon the name of God. That is the Medrash, that's the Drush, Doresh Rav Avira, that he said sometimes in the name of Ravami, Ravasi, and this appears at the end of a section, at the end of Tractate Psachim. The end of Tractate Psachim deals with the recitation of the Hallel at the Seder. So this is the Medrash. And now the question is, what does one make of the Medrash? And here we come to a very important question, critical question in terms of reading texts, which is tone. What is the tone of this Medrash? There's an article written about David and the Babylonian, which focuses on two main stories. One is the Gemara in Brachot that we saw, and I mentioned that last time, and the same writer writes about the story over here. And he believes that the story over here is actually critical of David, that there's a critique of David over here. I shall bless, and it is fitting that I bless. V'lina el varech. Moshe Rabbeinu couldn't do it. Avram Avinu couldn't do it. Yaakov couldn't do it, and it's fitting for you. So he sees the story as a critique of David. In my view, that is utterly and completely wrong. There is no sense in my understanding, I'll share my understanding, that there's a critique over here, and for a couple of reasons. And the first one is that this particular story is part of a larger section which talks about the Hallel. And in the section of the Hallel, which is the end of the day, what is Hallel? It's the recitation of 6 Psalms. And the Gemara presumes fundamentally that the author of Psalms is David. Not that he's necessarily the author of all the Psalms, but there is a presumption that the book of Psalms in general is David related. And over the course of the last 2 pages in this part of the tractate, which talks about the Hallel, it speaks about David, and it speaks about David and the anointing of David in the context of the Book of Shmuel and the context of Hallel. For example, there is just one side earlier, 119a, there's the discussion there about Psalm 118. There are 4 verses there, followed by another couple of verses. And the Medrash presents those verses as a dialogue between David, David's brothers, Samuel, and David's father on the occasion when Shmuel comes to the house of Yishai to anoint a king. God sends him in chapter 16 of 1 Samuel to anoint a new king. Saul is the king. There's a new king, and it's going to be David. He comes to the house, and of course, when he comes there, we remember the story. David isn't even there. The 7 sons of Yishai are there. David's out in the field. Yishai didn't even think to invite him altogether. And the Medrash picks up on these verses at the end of Hallel and has a conversation between them. As far as David is concerned, the verse they cite initially is Even Ma'asu Abonim Haytar Rosh Pinah, the rejected stone. The ones the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. So the Medrash, this whole piece of the Gemara, which focuses on Hallel, it sees David as central to Hallel. It sees David as the composer of prayers. The famous Gemara here, which you don't have in front of you, but says, sometimes it says Mizmor LeDavid, sometimes it says LeDavid Mizmar. So sometimes David was inspired on his own, and sometimes he would hear something, music or whatever, and the music would inspire him. Remember, we saw the Gemara in Brachot that David would wake up when the wind would come and play the harp, and that would wake David up. Sometimes we are inspired something inside us, and sometimes it's something external to ourselves. But the entire context here of these pages with David is all positive. So therefore, the context is very important, and I personally have no sense whatsoever that there is a critique of David. And we have to remember that we're talking about the meal that takes place at the end of days. And the tradition in general, and the Bavli in particular in Tractate Sanhedrin, we didn't look at those texts, talks about the Messiah. He's called Mashiach ben David. It's the Davidic line, which is messianic. Here we have a meal at the end of days. Now the question, of course, is, why is it true? If it's not a critique of David, David will say to them, I'll recite the blessing. It is fitting for me to recite the blessing. Not just I'll do it, but it's right. And he picks up the cup. So why is it more na'eh for David to leave the benching than for Moshe or Abraham? Or frankly, just about any of the others. But that's a very important question. And I think the reason has something to do with how this text sees David. And it sees David as the one who, the culmination of Jewish history. In other words, let's take Abraham and David. Abraham and David, Abraham is the one who sets up the covenant. Abraham is the one who symbolically possesses the land of Canaan. But he doesn't actually possess the land of Canaan. The land of Canaan he's a stranger in the land. God says in the covenant, the 4th generation shall return to the land. But Abraham sets it up. But when do we actually have the fulfillment? When is the full fulfillment of all of the promises? And the idea here is that there will come a day when all these promises are fulfilled, messianic times, and that's where David comes into play. So David is the one who will fulfill all of the blessings. So the first one who's offered to bless is Abraham. Abraham says it's not appropriate for me to lead the benching. And here, I'll make one more point and I'll stop and take comments or questions before we proceed. Here, actually, the Marsha, commentary on the Talmud, says a very important thing, which when you hear it sounds really correct. Why is it appropriate for David to lead Birkat HaMazon? It's not that he's greater than Moses or Abraham. But if we think about Birkat HaMazon, what is Birkat HaMazon about, actually? So actually, there are 3 blessings in Birkat HaMazon. The first one is about the God who actually sustains the world. The first blessing of Birkat HaMazon is rare in our tradition, I have to say. It speaks not about Israel, but it speaks about the world. Hazarat olam kulo b'tuvo, kol briotav asher bara. It's the most universal blessing we have. God who sustains all of God's creations. Not just the humans, all of God's creations. But the second blessing of Birkat HaMazon, Nodelocha Hashem Elokeinu, Al Shinchalta Lavotenu, that talks about the Jewish experience, and in particular the Jewish land. Jewish land. Al-Aretz v'Al HaMazon, on the land and the food, not just the food. So it's gratitude for the land that the Jewish people possessed, the covenantal land. That's the second blessing. And the third blessing is about, within this covenantal land, there's a sacred place. There's Jerusalem. Bonei Barachamav Yerushalayim. And in that blessing, by the way, not only does it talk about the temple, but it talks about the kingship of David. Malchut Beit David Mishichecha. It talks about David's kingship. So the truth of the matter is, in thinking about David's role, what David does actually in the Book of Shmuel is, number one, David is the person who completes possessing the land, because the land of Israel, which is basically captured in the Book of Judges, the time of Devorah, the great battle of Devorah and Barak, that's true, but there's one piece of Israel that's not yet in possession of Israel, which is Jerusalem. David captures Jerusalem. And not only does David capture Jerusalem in chapter 5 of 2 Samuel, but David is also the one who purchases the place for the temple. Mikdash David, his son Solomon builds the structure, but David purchases the place. So Birkat HaMazon is not just about food. Birkat HaMazon is gratitude for land and for temple. And the person instrumental, actually, in fulfilling the completion of conquest of the land, securing the land, but also the great temple builder, that's David. So what David is doing, in effect, is building on what all the others have done. It's Abraham, it's Moshe. They give us the path, but they're not the ones who actually fully fulfill the path. And it's David who fulfills the path. And this is actually, I mentioned the book that hopefully will come out. It's one of the things I point out in this Book of Shmuel, which I'm very happy with, I will say. We'll see what happens when it comes out. But is the connection between Abraham and David within the Book of Shmuel. There are many connections, which makes complete sense, because Abraham is the one who sets it all up, but David is the one who actually fulfills it. So the Medrash over here, I've embellished what the Maharsha says, but the idea of it's fitting that I bless is actually very true, because the very text of the blessing specifically is related to David's career, to David's life, both in terms of his conquest and also his setting up the temple. So I'll stop here for a moment if people have comments or questions, and then I want to come to discuss in the remainder of the time the idea that it is fitting that I bless. Apart from what I said now, I think there is something else about this particular story. But first, we'll stop for a moment. If anybody has comments, please speak up, or the chat, either way.
I had a thought.
Yes.
Which is there something characterological going on here? The procession of humility, and it shouldn't be me, and it shouldn't be me, almost becomes like a parody. We're here to do important honoring. And David is the one who blunders many times, but he's forceful and he's willing to take the step. And here, it feels like someone's got to do this. I'll do it. I'm David. I'm going to stand up and do it.
Okay, you could say that after everybody else has been, has refused to do it, that David is the last man standing. You could say that. I don't think it's only that. And I don't believe, actually, and we'll get to this soon, that when David says it is fitting that I do it, that the Talmud sees that as a kind of arrogance. We've come across a different story, a different psalm, in which the Talmud critiques David. He calls himself a Hasid. In what sense is David a Hasid? So the Talmud there raises some questions about that. And the fact of the matter is that in the Book of Shmuel, we have a song of David, which talks about himself as a chassid, as a pure soul. And when you read that, I think you're entitled to ask the question, he may be a good soul, but a pure soul, I wouldn't say he is in the Book of Shmuel. Even a good soul is maybe questionable. But the fact of the matter is, I don't get that sense over here. And when David says the Hebrew is, Ani avarech, v'li na'el levarech. Na'el levarech, I think, is not boastful. It's saying it is appropriate. And what's interesting is that expression, na'el levarech, we have in our services. We say in Psukei de Zimra, Shabbat, we have the prayer called Birkat Asher Nishmat. It is appropriate to praise. It's appropriate to give thanks. It's appropriate to praise. And in fact, in that text, Al Kol Divrei Shirot V'Tishbachot David Ben Yishai, and even beyond David's songs, David's praises. So now it's interesting, by the way, at the Seder. So with the Seder, we say Hallel. We say Hallel. And then there's a custom at the end of the Seder to sing songs, right? Chad Gadya, we end the Seder with Chad Gadya, right? I don't know what the Sephardim do, Ashkenazim. But there's another song we usually sing at the end of the Seder. Ki lo na'eh, ki lo ya'eh.
Ki lo na'eh.
Ki lo na'eh, ki lo ya'eh. That's the
That's
refrain. And what it's picking up on, actually, is precisely what we said earlier. That during the Seder, we say Hallel. And we say after Hallel, this is Na'eh, it's appropriate. And after the Seder is over, we say something else. The night of the Seder is a night of thanksgiving, it's a night of song, it's a night of praise. And then we say, even though we've praised God a lot, there's a lot more to say. There's no limit. So we're going to continue to sing even afterwards, Ki lo na'eh, ki lo ya'eh. So Ki lo na'eh actually strikes me as not an inappropriate statement in the context here, in the context of these pages at the end of Tractate Psachim.
Rabbi,
Yes,
can you hear me?
yes, I do.
So you started by, you're connecting Abraham and David, and I think you started it by saying that it says about David that he did mishpat and tzedakah,
Yes,
and
I
that's
did.
the first thing that God says in recognition of Abraham. Ki yidativ et asher yatzeh banav v'asot tzedakah mishpat.
Yes, I will
Those
get to
two
that
things.
in
I mean,
3
as
minutes.
you said, there are probably many others, but that just struck me because you started by saying that David is
Yes, I
described
was
as
going to
having
pick up on
done
that right away. And
mishpat
just
and
to,
tzedakah.
yes, thank you for that. I will embellish what I said in the beginning about mishpat and tzedakah. Yeah, mishpat and tzedakah. Let me just respond to that, and I'll take one more. Mishpat and tzedakah, you're very correct. That appears in chapter 18 of Breshit, when God says to Abraham, I can't conceal from Abraham what I plan to do to Sodom. I'm hearing terrible things. I can't conceal it from you because I know that you command your household la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. So tzedakah u'mishpat appears the first time in the Bible in conjunction with Abraham's behavior. And what's interesting is, if you think about it, where do we see Abraham doing tzedakah u'mishpat in the Torah? And in fact, why can't God conceal from Abraham what God plans to do? Why must God tell Abraham what God plans to do? But there's a reason for it in Breshit. And the reason, I think, is that in chapter 18, God is thinking about destroying Sodom. But remember that in chapter 14, just 4 chapters earlier, Abraham saved Sodom. He saved Sodom from those that were more powerful than Sodom. He saved the people. He saved their possessions. He brought them back. And the saving of the weak from the poor, the Torah calls that tzedakah or mishpat. That's what tzedakah or mishpat is. So they may be bad people and they'll be punished, but I can't conceal from the man who saved them that I plan to destroy them. And when you look at chapter 14 of Genesis, Breshit 14, you see something very interesting. In that chapter, 4 words appear in that chapter describing the wars. One is mishpat, in mishpat. One is chovah. One is dan, which is din. And then the person that comes out to greet Abraham after the war is Malki Tzedek. So you have tzedakah, you have mishpat, you have din, and you have chovah, 4 judicial terms. And therefore, and my point here relevant to us is that what Abraham is doing is caring for those on the margins. And when he goes and fights, he takes everybody with him. And he makes sure all the people that come with him get their fair portion of the spoils. He takes nothing for himself. And then when it speaks of David of doing tzedakah or mishpat, what the Gemara that we saw last time, Gemara in Brachot, he's busy in the morning trying to figure out ways to help the woman, looking at the blood. Mephibosheth is with him. When you read it, you say to yourself, but when you read the Book of Shmuel, those people remind us of a different David, and that's true. But the point of the Bavli is there is another David. We know of the other David, and we will critique him right and left in the Bavli. But there's this David that we are painting, the ideal David, and that's also in the Book of Samuel. So that's the tzedakah or mishpat. Tzedek and mishpat in the Bible means protecting people who are on the margins. God's great enemy in the Bible is actually Amalek. The enemy of God is Amalek. Why? Because Amalek always attacks the weak, scattered and dispersed the weak. That's God's enemy. So tzedakah or mishpat, the link to Abraham, is actually very important in describing. It's the David who, when he hears about the poor guy who has one little lamb, and the rich guy took away his lamb, and Nathan the prophet says, "What do you think about that?" And David got exceedingly angry. That person deserves to die. Can you imagine that? He says, "No compassion. Guy has one lamb." Nathan says, "It's you." But the point of the story is, it is David. But the other David is also the one who is angry about it. That's also David. And the Bavli, which likes to see all sides of everything, is presenting us not just with the David Bathsheba negative story, not just with Nob, not just with Naval, and all of those stories, which are all there. But here you have the Tzedek or Mishpat, and the context over here, and we might remind ourselves, our prayers are the prayers of David. David is the great composer of the prayers. So over here, David says, "I will bless, and it is fitting that I bless." I'll come back to that as well. I'll take one more comment and we'll proceed.
David, can I was thinking right at the beginning as we're going through this whole list, the way each one of the persons describes himself is very black and white. I can't do it because I'm the father of Esav. I can't do it because I did this wrong. I did that wrong. And the way you've been describing David, he is really the image of pulling together, being a full human being, not seeing himself as black and white, evil because he did one wrong thing, but he really presents to us the full meaning of life. And in that sense, he's a culmination not only of history, but sort of human development.
Okay, I will pick up, that's a good point. I will pick up on that point. That's the way I wanted to end this session. And I think that is true. And by the way, I would add to what you're saying, it's a different point, but Jacob, Isaac and Abraham say, "I can't lead the benching because, Ishmael, Esav." Now, when you look at David's children, I think it's fair to say that there is no more failed parent than King David. Talking about Amnon, who's a terrible person, Avshalom, who tries to kill his father and is killed in return, Adoniah, who is parading around the city while his father is sick and dying, David's son born from Bathsheba dies, and his daughter Tamar is the victim of a terrible rape by her own brother. So the point of it is, it's not about, I think, that I had a child who didn't follow in my path or maybe was a wicked child. I think the point over here has to do with succession. At the end of the day, David succeeds in establishing the kingship. And at the end of the day, and this is the main point, that he is the fulfillment of all that has come before. Now, Judy's point is an important one, and I'll get back to that, which is there's something about David's own life over here, which is also part and parcel of the story, and I think very powerful piece of the story, and a powerful piece of David. And what the text is doing over here, actually, among other things, Rabbi Avira, in this drush of his, he's picking up on a particular verse in the book of Tehillim. Kos Yeshuot Esa Uveshem Hashem Ekra. I lift up the cup of salvation, and I will call upon the name of God. It's a verse that we say when we say Havdalah, the Ashkenazic version of Havdalah. Kos Yeshuot Esa Uveshem Hashem Ekra. So they're pointing us, I think, the drasha points us to a particular text. And it's this text that I wanted to spend the remainder of the time on.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Just one question before we leave this. Is it possible that when David says, Ani avarech, li na'el varech, is it possible that that's the Bavli, that's the Bavli speaking, that the Bavli is saying he is most fitting to bless? Because as you suggested before when you were narrating the Talmud's Agadah, every single one of the predecessors was appropriate to bless, and it's almost comical or ridiculous or false modesty to the point of, okay, enough already. So maybe what the Bavli is doing is it knows that the others were fitting too, but that the Bavli is leading up to this in an argumentative style that it does, and we go along with it like we do it in the refrain of a song. We know what's coming, which is that it's the Bavli's opinion that he is na'eh.
For sure. I mean, the point is, the Bavli says a million different things. This particular story that I wanted to end with, of course, it's the Bavli's take. The Bavli is saying there's something about David and Birkat. It's not saying David is greater than Moses. The Bavli would never suggest anything remotely resembling that. But people have different missions. And it's saying that what David represents in terms of the end of days, which this is the feast at the end of days, that David is the one who is the fulfillment, who has built upon those who come before, of course, but he is the fulfillment. He's the messianic dream. He represents our hopes. And I think, let me just get to this particular psalm. Psalm 116, of course, is one of the psalms that are recited in one of the 6 psalms of the Hallel. It's personally one of my favorite, if not my most favorite psalm of all. And it's one of those psalms that when we say the whole Hallel, we say the whole psalm. When we say what's called half Hallel, partial Hallel, like on Rosh Chodesh, we skip the first part of it. It begins with Ahavti, Psalm 116, Ahavti ki yishma Hashem et koli tachnunai. This is the psalm in which the verse is found, Kos Yeshuot Esau v'Shem Hashem Ekra. So it begins by saying that I love when God hears my voice and my cries, my pleas. I am encompassed by bonds of death. Torments of Sheol, the underworld, overtook me. I came upon trouble and sorrow. I invoked God's name. Shem Hashem Ekra. I called out God's name. Here we have the expression B'Shem Hashem Ekra. Ana Hashem Maltan Nafshi. Oh, deliver me, God. And God did. Chanun Hashem b'tzadik ve'oheinu merachem. God is gracious and beneficent, compassionate. Here we have the words Chanun and Rachum that we're so familiar with from our prayers. And the next verse is striking. Shomer Pita'im Hashem. Daloti v'liyo shia. God protects Pita'im. Well, what is a petty? A petty is one who doesn't have wisdom. A simpleton. Sometimes it's a bit negative. Here they translate the simple, which is not the same as simpleton. Someone with no knowledge. We say in the different psalm, Edut Hashem machkimat pesi, makes wise the petty. So here David speaks about himself. David speaks about himself, not as a chassid, not as a tzaddik, nothing like that. Shomer pitayim Hashem. David was a very clever person, very clever, very cunning, very skillful, the great orator, speaks about himself as a petty. as a simpleton, a simple person. God cares for the simple. God watches over the simple. Shuvi nafshi l'nuchaychi. It's one of the great psalms that we have. Shuvi nafshi l'nuchaychi. Here they translate, be at rest once again, my soul. Ki Hashem gomal olaychi. God has been good to you. You have delivered me from death. Ki lasta nafshi mimavet. My eyes from tears, my feet from stumbling. I shall walk before the Lord in the lands of the living. That's what the psalmist David is doing the talking here. That's how the Medrash sees it. The text doesn't say David. But the Medrash is reading David into the story. And then it says, Hemanti ki adaber ani aniti ma'od. That's how they translate that. I trust in God out of great suffering. I think what that means is when I was in terrible suffering, I maintained my trust. Ani amarti b'chabzi, here they translate, I spoke and said rashly, all men are false. I would prefer to translate it differently. I would say, even as I said in my haste, in my flight, that all humans are deceptive, all humans lie. There are no honest people in the world. You can't trust anybody. Even as I believed that in my flight, I kept the faith. Hamanti ki adaber ani aniti mi'od. B'chavzi, when I was running away, nechpaz lorechet. And actually, in reading this verse, and we come back to what Judy, I think, had hinted at before, when you think about the book of Samuel and think about David, there's something very striking about the book of Shmuel, which is that most of the book, when it talks about David, is about David running away. We encounter David when he's first anointed secretly in chapter 16. Chapter 18 already he's on the run. And he's on the run all the way from chapter 18 to the very end of 1 Samuel, just 13 chapters. And then for several chapters, there's a war. He's still not the king. He's anointed king, but in chapter 3 or 4. And then already, beginning in chapter 9, you see the beginning of trouble. The Bathsheba story, it begins in chapter 10 and chapter 11. And a few chapters later, he's again in exile, running from his son. So the story of David, actually, in the book of Shmuel, the great focus is about someone who lives, who's on the run, who's running away from his enemies, which the Psalms constantly refer to. But even as I ran, says David, the psalmist, I kept the faith. And I remembered a different story from the book of Shmuel, which is the following story. David runs away to the Philistines. In chapter 30, actually runs away earlier, 27, I think it is. And in chapter 30, he was invited by the Philistine leaders, the king, to accompany his army with David's men to fight against Saul and Israel. And David starts to go with him. And then in the middle of this, before he gets to the war, the other Philistine generals don't want David. They don't trust him. So they send David home. And David comes back to his city of Ziklag, where he lives. And when he comes back, all the children and all the women and their possessions have been captured by an enemy, unknown enemy. David's lost his wives. The men have lost their wives and their children. And it says, and the men were very bitter. Remember, David's men initially basically were a bunch of criminals and desperados. And they want to kill David. They're thinking of killing David. And David took strength in God. And then David turns everything around and he manages to lead his men to great victory. That's what you have described over here, actually, of somebody who has great faith, actually. That's the description over here. Even as I lost faith in everything else. But I kept the faith, and my faith was rewarded. I will walk among God in the land of the living. That's verse number 11. And now we have this is a continuation. Verse number 12. Here's a question that appears elsewhere in the book of Tehillim, and a very central question, I think, very powerful question. And the question is, Ma shiv l'Hashem ko tagmuloi alai. And David's question is, how can I repay God for all the good that God has done And the word for good over here is tagmulohi. Gemul, that's the medrash actually, right? The medrash is about the word gemul. Vayas Abraham mishteh gadol b'yom higamel et Yitzchak. And someday God will be gomel to Isaac's children. So we encounter the word gomel right over here. Ma'ashiv lash, and David asked the question, how can I repay God for the good that God has done? We actually had it earlier in verse number 7. Shuvi nafshi limnuchaychi. Return, rest my soul. Return to your place of rest. Ki Hashem gamal alaychi. For God has been gracious or bountiful to me. So the word gamal appears twice in the psalm, actually. So the Medrash, Rabbi Avira's drasha, takes us to the story, and David asked the question, how can I repay God? It's a question, actually, that appears elsewhere in the Psalms. Psalm number 40, which you don't have, also talks about someone who was delivered. And the psalmist asked the question, what can I do? How can I repay you for what you've done to me? You don't want my sacrifices. What can I do to repay you? Azamarti hine bati, b'megillat sefer katuv alai. And then I said, I have come with a book written about me. And by that, I believe the psalmist means in chapter 40, Psalm 40, I can tell my story to the world. I have an obligation. I can't pay God back, but I can tell other people of God's kindnesses. Pay it forward. If I was saved, if someone helped me out, then I have a responsibility to tell other people to help them as well. And that's the Ba'ashiv Hashem is the great question. How can I repay it for all the good? And the answer is, Kos Yeshuot Esa Uv'Shem Hashem Ekra. I will pick up the cup of salvation and I will proclaim God's name. And in the Drush of Rabbi Avira, actually, the idea of publicly proclaiming the God who has delivered me, which is the story of David's life. It's about the one who's constantly running away. The psalmist picked this up. And David's sitting at the table with our great heroes. And David says, it's appropriate that I lead, it's fitting that I do it. Because my obligation is to proclaim God's name. Because God saved me so many times. I'm here by the grace of God. So it's not a boast. It's quite the opposite. It's saying it's appropriate that it's my obligation to do it. That's Kos Yeshuot Esau B'Shem Hashem Ekra. And then David adds, the psalmist adds, whom the Medrash sees as David, Nidarai Hashem Hashalem Negda na l'chomo. I will fulfill my vows. And here the point is, Negda na l'cholamo, in the presence of all of God's people. And then it goes to the end. He repeats it again in verse number 18. Nidarai Hashem Hashalem Negda na l'cholamo. I will fulfill my vow before all the people. And where are all the people? What is the space that represents the space of all people? And the answer, of course, is B'chatzrot Beit Hashem, in the courtyards of God, B'tochechi Yerushalayim, in the midst of Jerusalem, the temple. The temple is the place for all of Israel. In fact, for Solomon, it's the place for the whole world. The whole world will come to the temple to serve God. What better place to proclaim God's kindnesses, says David, than in the presence of God's space? What greater place to proclaim God's kindnesses than in the presence of Moses and Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and all who came before? So that's how the Medrash is seeing it. The Medrash in Dorosh Rav Avira is seeing this other side of David. Maybe it's the David of the Psalms. It's the David of this particular psalm. And that's the Gmol. Vayas Abraham mishteh gadol b'yom higamel et Yitzchak. And he made a great party, one might say, out of gratitude to God. God had made promises. Abraham, at points in his life, saw no possibility that the promise would be fulfilled. And you can think about it this way with Abraham and David, formulated this way. David is anointed in the house of his father, in the house of Jesse. And 2 chapters later, he's on the run. And Saul is chasing after him with thousands of soldiers. On more than one occasion, has the opportunity to kill him. And all the trials and the tribulations and the difficulties. And At the end of the day, David secures the kingship and is able, with all the trouble, with succession, he does finally establish the kingship. And he says, actually, it's a miracle that I was able to do what I did. Without God's help, it would have been impossible. Ani amarti b'chavzi, I said in my haste, you can trust nobody. But I didn't give up the faith. So he's proclaiming this actually at this great meal at the end of time. And that's the story of Jewish history. It's not just the story of David personally, I would say. The story of Jewish history, perhaps as the Babylonian sees it, is a story of exile. It's a story of persecution with all kinds of twists and turns and difficulties. And we still hold the faith in general and especially at the Seder. Because this Hallel is the Hallel of the Seder. And at the Seder, we have Elijah's cup. With the difficulties, we sit in exile and we believe through the behavior at the Seder that there is a hope for the future. So David represents the best hope for the future. I would just like to conclude, and I'll take comments and questions, that this idea of David actually as the one who represents the possibilities, the one who represents as part of our aspirations, whether it's the temple, whether it's dwelling in God's space. We actually have this in a very beautiful prayer that we say on the Yamim Noraim, the High Holiday service, in the third blessing. Third blessing of the Shemona Esrei, of course, is about God's sanctity, El HaKadosh. But on Rosh Hashanah, instead of saying El HaKadosh, we say HaMelech HaKadosh, the Holy King. That's the third blessing. And in that blessing, there's a little poem that traditionally the Jewish people recite, which begins with the word Uvechein. The first three paragraphs, well, the first paragraph is Uvechein tein pachtecha Hashem Elokeinu al kol ma'asecha. We say, God, cause the fear of you to fall over all of humanity, so that they will, we say, Yirucha kol ma'asim, v'yishtachavu lefanecha kol b'ruim, v'yasu kulam aguda achat, that the world joins together, the whole world, la'asot ritzoncha b'leivav shalem, with a full heart. So they'll be inspired to actually accept you fully with a full heart. That's the first blessing. And then we come to the second blessing. The first blessing is about all of humanity. And then the second blessing is, Uvechein tein kavod Hashem li'amecha. We ask God, bring dignity to your people. Ti'ila li'reyecha. Those that fear you should be admired. Tikva tova l'dorshecha. And hopes for those who seek you out. Pitchon pela mayachalim lach, for those who search for God, who believe in God, give them a confidence. Simcha li'artzecha, sason li'irecha, joy for your land, utzmichat keren l'David abdecha. It's one of the beautiful prayers that we have. Aricha ner leven yishai meshichecha b'nei Rabbi Amenu, the messianic hope, which is all about David. So David appears in that very powerful prayer that we have, which talks about God's kingship, HaMelech HaKadosh. And the liturgy actually sees the kingship of David not as contradicting God's kingship. It's not a contradiction. It sees it as a reflection of God's kingship. The blessing ends with God, the Holy King. But our liturgy doesn't see that as contradicting David's kingship. Smichat keren l'David avdecha, arichat ner leven yishai meshichecha, b'mheira v'yameinu. That's our hope. That's our prayer. So basically that David, who appears in the liturgy in that guise many times, actually. You know, when you talk about Jewish theology, I'm not a theologian, but I think one place to look at, if you want to know something about Jewish thought through the ages, is the Siddur, the prayer book, the Maser. It's a reflection, actually, I think, and a deep reflection of what Jews have believed in, what the aspirations, what the hopes are. So David appears prominently, not just as the one who writes the songs, but David appears as representing a kind of hope for the future. And that's what this Dorish Rav Avira is picking up on. Because it's not just the history of the Jewish people, it's David's own history. And I'll conclude with something that appears in these pages at the end of Psachim. The Talmud says, David who composed the Psalms. Sometimes he wrote about it from his own personal experience. He's talking about himself. And sometimes he's talking about the Jewish people, about the community. And I would say that actually, I think every writer is always talking about themselves, actually, because we see the world through our own experience. But the point, I think, of the Medrash is that the life of David and the David who's constantly running away, but somehow is able to return and to maintain his confidence in his faith, is also the story of the Jewish people. And that's how the Medrash sees it. So what is more appropriate than the person whose life represents the difficulties of life, the mistakes of life, the idea of exile. There were times when David almost gives up. There were times in the Book of Shmuel when he gives up, actually. When Avshalom takes over, he says, go back to King Avshalom, forget me. But somehow he's able to move forward. And the end of the day, he's able to fulfill the great promise. That is parallel, as the Medrash sees it, to the story of the Jewish people. So the end of days, looking back, who's the one who should bless, if not King David? And I'll stop at this point. Just to summarize what we've done, we wanted to get a picture through the Bavli, actually, of how the Bavli imagines David. And I chose about, 10 or so texts from the Bavli. There were some others, but I think we touched upon some of the main stories. And hopefully what got through, I hope, is that the Bavli is not just telling stories, but the Bavli is always interpreting as well. There's a deep interpretation of particular verses and of the larger narrative with the Talmud Bavli. It begins with these various texts they have before them, and they use these texts to describe a David that perhaps is very relevant to when they are speaking. The David of the Bavli speaks like a Talmudic scholar, or Talmudic pupil, I would say, more than scholar. And that's also an important message from the Bavli, that I think it's important to be able to translate our tradition into contemporary terms, and to understand how these texts continue to speak to us, which is what the Medrash is basically doing. What the Medrash is trying to do at all times is to figure out a way to enable us who live very far from what took place to see these texts as relevant in our own lives, to ask our own questions, and to engage in the process of interpretation, which is what the Bavli is, I think, leading us on this path. Anyway, so thank you very much for joining. If anybody has comments or questions, let's hear. And if you think of something later, you can send me an email. I'm happy to try to respond.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you, Rabbi Silber.